Question 1. When evaluating an organization's adherence to ISO 14009-2020 guidelines for integrating environmental aspects into product design, what specific combination of knowledge and skills is most critical for an internal auditor to possess? Option A. A thorough understanding of product lifecycle assessment methodologies, relevant environmental legislation impacting product design, e.g., material restrictions, energy efficiency mandates, and proficiency in ISO 19011 auditing principles. Option B. Advanced skills in chemical engineering for material analysis, comprehensive knowledge of international trade agreements concerning environmental goods, and experience in supply chain logistics management. Option C. Expertise in financial risk assessment related to environmental liabilities, a deep understanding of marketing strategies for eco-friendly products, and general knowledge of environmental science. Option D. Extensive experience in manufacturing process optimization, detailed knowledge of corporate social responsibility reporting frameworks, and familiarity with ISO 9001 quality management principles. The correct answer is A. A thorough understanding of product lifecycle assessment methodologies, relevant environmental legislation impacting product design, e.g., material restrictions, energy efficiency mandates, and proficiency in ISO 19011 auditing principles. Explanation. The core competency for an internal auditor examining the integration of environmental aspects into product design and development, as guided by ISO 14009-2020, involves more than just understanding environmental management systems. It requires a specific blend of knowledge. ISO 14009 emphasizes the life cycle perspective of products and the proactive identification and management of environmental impacts from the initial concept through to end of life. An auditor must therefore possess a foundational understanding of product development processes, including design, material selection, manufacturing, use, and disposal. Crucially, they need to be familiar with environmental regulations relevant to product design and manufacturing, such as those concerning chemical restrictions, e.g., RoHS, REACH, or energy efficiency standards, which directly influence product design choices. Beyond this, the auditor must be proficient in auditing methodologies, including planning, conducting interviews, collecting and analyzing evidence, and reporting findings in accordance with the principles of ISO 19011. The ability to assess the effectiveness of the organization's processes for identifying, evaluating, and controlling environmental aspects throughout the product lifecycle is paramount. This includes evaluating how environmental considerations are embedded into design reviews, material specifications, and supplier selection criteria. Therefore, a comprehensive understanding of product design principles, relevant environmental legislation, and robust auditing techniques forms the bedrock of auditor competence in this specialized area. Question 2. When auditing the concept development phase of a new portable audio player, an internal auditor for an ISO 14009-2020 certified company observes that the design team has identified a significant challenge with the proposed bioplastic casing. The material, while renewable, degrades prematurely when exposed to common environmental conditions like humidity and UV radiation, potentially leading to early product failure and increased waste. The auditor needs to assess how effectively the team is integrating environmental aspects into this early design stage. Which of the following actions by the auditor would best align with the principles of ISO 14009-2020 for proactive environmental integration during concept development? Option A. Suggest conducting a comprehensive life cycle assessment, LCA, immediately to quantify the environmental impacts of the proposed bioplastic, even though the concept is still in its nascent stages. Option B. Recommend the design team investigate alternative bioplastic formulations or composite materials that offer greater durability against environmental degradation, or explore design modifications to protect the casing from such exposures. Option C. Advise the design team to defer detailed end-of-life management strategies until the prototype stage, focusing solely on the material's renewability in the current concept. Option D. Propose that the design team prioritize developing a detailed product take-back and recycling program for the bioplastic casing, regardless of its early degradation concerns. The correct answer is B. Recommend the design team investigate alternative bioplastic formulations or composite materials that offer greater durability against environmental degradation, or explore design modifications to protect the casing from such exposures. Explanation. During the concept development phase for a new electronic device, an internal auditor for an organization certified to ISO 14009-2020 is reviewing the process for integrating environmental aspects. The auditor notes that the design team has identified potential end-of-life concerns for a novel composite material used in the device's casing. Specifically, the material is difficult to separate for recycling due to its integrated nature with other components. ISO 14009-2020 emphasizes a life cycle perspective and the prevention of environmental impacts. In the concept development stage, the focus should be on proactive measures to mitigate these identified issues. The most effective approach at this early stage is to explore alternative materials or design modifications that facilitate easier disassembly and separation of materials for recycling or responsible disposal. This aligns with the standard's guidance on considering environmental aspects throughout the product's life cycle, from raw material acquisition to end of life. Focusing solely on end-of-life management after the concept is finalized would be reactive and less effective in preventing environmental burdens. Conducting a full life cycle assessment, LCA, is a valuable tool, but its primary role is to quantify impacts across the entire life cycle, not to dictate initial design choices for material selection in concept development. Similarly, developing a detailed end-of-life management plan is crucial, but should stem from design decisions made during concept development, not be the primary driver of those decisions. Engaging with recyclers to understand their capabilities is important, but the core responsibility for designing for recyclability lies with the product development team during concept creation. Therefore, the auditor would prioritize the exploration of design for disassembly and material substitution to address the identified end-of-life challenges proactively. Question 3. An internal auditor is reviewing the effectiveness of an organization's product design and development process in integrating environmental aspects, as guided by ISO 14009-2020. The organization has set targets to reduce the use of non-renewable materials by 15% and increase the recyclability of its new product lines by 20% within 2 years. The auditor is examining the monitoring and measurement of progress towards these targets. Which of the following actions by the auditor would best assess the robustness of the organization's monitoring system for these integrated environmental aspects? Option A. Interviewing the design team to understand their general awareness of environmental regulations like the Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment (WEEE) directive and their personal commitment to sustainability. Option B. Reviewing the product design specifications to confirm that environmental considerations were included in the initial design briefs without necessarily checking the ongoing performance data. Option C. Examining the marketing materials for the new product lines to ensure they highlight the environmental benefits achieved, irrespective of the underlying data's accuracy or the monitoring process. Option D. Verifying that the organization collects data on the percentage of non-renewable materials used and the recyclability score of new products, and that this data is compared against the established targets with documented analysis of any deviations. The correct answer is D. Verifying that the organization collects data on the percentage of non-renewable materials used and the recyclability score of new products, and that this data is compared against the established targets with documented analysis of any deviations. Explanation. ISO 14009-2020 emphasizes the integration of environmental considerations throughout the product lifecycle, from design to end of life. Monitoring and measurement of progress in this integration are crucial for demonstrating effectiveness and driving continuous improvement. When assessing the integration of environmental aspects into product design and development, an internal auditor must evaluate how well the organization is tracking its performance against established environmental objectives and targets related to product design. This involves examining the methods used to collect, analyze, and report data on key environmental indicators associated with product design and development processes. For instance, an auditor might look at metrics such as the reduction in hazardous materials used in a new product design, the increase in recycled content incorporated, or the improvement in energy efficiency of a product as a result of design changes. The effectiveness of the monitoring system is judged by its ability to provide reliable information that supports decision-making, identifies areas for improvement, and confirms compliance with internal policies and external regulations, such as the EU's restriction of hazardous substances, RoHS, directive, or the principles of the circular economy. The auditor's role is to verify that the monitoring framework is robust, that the data collected is accurate, and that the insights derived are used to enhance the environmental performance of the product design and development process. This requires understanding the specific environmental aspects identified for the products and the corresponding performance indicators chosen by the organization. Question 4. An internal auditor is evaluating an organization's product design and development process for compliance with ISO 14009-2020. The organization's environmental management system, certified to ISO 14001, has identified resource depletion as a significant environmental aspect. During the audit, the auditor reviews the design documentation for a new electronic device. Which of the following findings would indicate the most effective integration of ISO 14009 principles into the design process, demonstrating a proactive approach to mitigating resource depletion? Option A. The design team selected a supplier for a key component based primarily on the supplier's ISO 14001 certification, assuming this would inherently ensure environmentally responsible material sourcing. Option B. The product development plan included a review of potential end-of-life recycling options for the device, with a note to consider them if regulatory requirements change. Option C. The design team documented a decision to use recycled aluminum for the device casing after a cost-benefit analysis indicated it was financially viable compared to virgin aluminum. Option D. The project manager noted that the bill of materials was finalized without specific consideration of the embodied energy or rarity of the materials used, as the focus was on performance specifications. The correct answer is C. The design team documented a decision to use recycled aluminum for the device casing after a cost-benefit analysis indicated it was financially viable compared to virgin aluminum. Explanation: ISO 14009-2020 provides guidelines for integrating environmental considerations into product design and development, aiming to achieve environmental improvements throughout a product's life cycle. It complements ISO 14001, which establishes the framework for an environmental management system, EMS. While ISO 14001 focuses on the overall organizational system for managing environmental impacts, ISO 14009 specifically targets the design and development process to proactively prevent pollution and enhance environmental performance of products. An internal auditor assessing an organization's adherence to ISO 14009 would need to verify that the principles and methodologies outlined in the standard are effectively applied within the product creation lifecycle. This includes examining how environmental aspects identified through ISO 14001 are translated into design specifications, material selection, manufacturing processes, and end-of-life considerations. The auditor must ensure that the integration is not merely a procedural step, but a fundamental part of achieving the organization's environmental policy and objectives, as driven by the EMS. For instance, if the EMS identifies energy consumption as a significant environmental aspect, the auditor would look for evidence in the design and development records that this aspect was systematically addressed through energy-efficient design choices, material sourcing, and manufacturing process optimization, aligning with the proactive approach advocated by ISO 14009. The effectiveness of this integration is measured by demonstrable environmental improvements in the product itself, rather than solely the existence of documentation. Question 5. During an internal audit of a manufacturing firm's product design process, an auditor is reviewing the application of life cycle assessment, LCA, principles as guided by ISO 14009-2020. The LCA for a new line of portable power banks identified significant environmental burdens associated with the extraction of rare earth minerals for battery components and the energy-intensive manufacturing of the casing. The auditor needs to assess the effectiveness of the design team's response to these findings. Which of the following auditor conclusions most accurately reflects a thorough evaluation of the integration of LCA results into product design. According to the standard's intent, Option A, the design team's decision to provide detailed disposal instructions to consumers based on the LCA's end-of-life phase analysis effectively addresses the standard's requirements for product design integration. Option B, the design team's focus on reducing packaging materials, a minor impact identified in the LCA, indicates a commitment to environmental improvement, even if the major impact areas were not directly addressed in the design. Option C, the design team's acknowledgement of the LCA findings in a project report without concrete design modifications signifies that the environmental aspects have been considered as required by the standard. Option D, the design team's efforts to source recycled aluminum for the casing and explore alternative battery chemistries with less reliance on rare earth minerals demonstrate a robust integration of LCA findings to mitigate identified environmental impacts. Correct answer is D. The design team's efforts to source recycled aluminum for the casing and explore alternative battery chemistries with less reliance on rare earth minerals demonstrate a robust integration of LCA findings to mitigate identified environmental impacts. Explanation: the fundamental principle of ISO 14009-2020 concerning the integration of environmental aspects into product design and development, particularly when focusing on life cycle assessment (LCA), is to systematically identify and evaluate the environmental impacts of a product throughout its entire life cycle. This life cycle encompasses raw material acquisition, product design, manufacturing, distribution, use, and end-of-life treatment. An internal auditor's role is to verify that the organization's processes for integrating environmental considerations into product design are effective and conform to the standard's guidelines. When assessing the LCA methodology employed by a company, the auditor must ensure that the scope and boundaries of the assessment are clearly defined and appropriate for the product and its intended use. This includes considering all relevant environmental impact categories, such as climate change, acidification, eutrophication, and resource depletion, as well as ensuring the data used is reliable and representative. The auditor would also verify that the results of the LCA are used to inform design decisions, aiming to reduce environmental burdens at various stages. For instance, if an LCA highlights significant energy consumption during the use phase of an electronic device, the auditor would look for evidence that design teams have explored options for improving energy efficiency in subsequent product iterations. Similarly, if end-of-life processing, such as recycling or disposal, shows substantial environmental impacts, the auditor would check if design choices are being made to facilitate easier disassembly, material recovery, or use of more environmentally benign disposal methods. The standard emphasizes a proactive approach, moving beyond mere compliance with environmental regulations to a strategic integration of environmental performance into product development, driven by robust LCA practices. Question 6. During an internal audit of a company's product design and development process, an auditor is reviewing the record-keeping practices related to environmental aspects as per ISO 14009-2020. The auditor finds that while environmental considerations are discussed in design meetings, the minutes lack specific details on how identified environmental aspects influence design decisions, or the rationale behind the selection of certain materials based on their environmental impact. Additionally, records of compliance checks against evolving environmental regulations relevant to the product's target markets are not consistently maintained or easily retrievable. Which of the following best describes the deficiency in record keeping that an internal auditor would identify in this scenario concerning the integration of environmental aspects into product design and development? Option A. Absence of any records pertaining to environmental aspects within the product design and development documentation, indicating a complete disregard for ISO 14009-2020 guidelines. Option B. Overly detailed documentation of environmental aspects that impedes efficient review and decision-making, contrary to the principles of lean documentation. Option C. Inadequate documentation of the linkage between identified environmental aspects and subsequent design decisions, as well as inconsistent maintenance of records demonstrating compliance with relevant environmental legislation throughout the design process. Option D. records solely focusing on end-of-life environmental considerations, without adequately addressing upstream impacts during the material selection and manufacturing phases of the product design. The correct answer is C. Inadequate documentation of the linkage between identified environmental aspects and subsequent design decisions, as well as inconsistent maintenance of records demonstrating compliance with relevant environmental legislation throughout the design process. Explanation: ISO 14009-2020, in its guidance for integrating environmental aspects into product design and development, emphasizes the importance of maintaining records that demonstrate conformity and the effectiveness of the environmental management system as it pertains to product design. Specifically, Clause 8.1.3, control of documented information, and related subclauses within the standards framework for design and development controls mandate the creation, updating, and retention of records. These records are crucial for providing objective evidence that environmental aspects have been considered, evaluated, and addressed throughout the product lifecycle, from conception to end of life. For an internal auditor, verifying the adequacy and accessibility of these records is paramount. This includes ensuring that design and development inputs, such as environmental legislation compliance requirements, e.g., REACH, RoHS directives in relevant jurisdictions, customer environmental specifications, and internal environmental performance targets are documented. Furthermore, records of design and development outputs, including design reviews where environmental aspects were discussed and decisions made, prototypes tested for environmental performance, and final product specifications with documented environmental characteristics must be available. The retention period for these records should be determined by the organization based on legal requirements, contractual obligations, and the product's life cycle, ensuring that evidence of environmental consideration is available for future reference, audits, or potential product obsolescence management. The auditor's role is to confirm that a systematic approach to record keeping exists, covering the entire design and development process, thereby supporting the organization's commitment to environmental stewardship in product creation. Question 7. When conducting an internal audit of an organization's environmental management system focused on integrating environmental aspects into product design and development according to ISO 14009-2020, what is the primary consideration for an auditor when evaluating the defined scope of the system? Option A. Whether the scope primarily focuses on the organization's manufacturing operations rather than the design and development activities themselves. Option B. Whether the scope is limited to only the initial conceptualization and material selection phases of product development, excluding downstream impacts. Option C. Whether the scope adequately encompasses all relevant product design and development processes and their associated environmental aspects across the product lifecycle, aligning with the organization's environmental policy and relevant legislation like RoHS and WE. Option D. Whether the scope exclusively addresses end-of-life product management without considering the environmental impacts during the design and use phases. The correct answer is C. Whether the scope adequately encompasses all relevant product design and development processes and their associated environmental aspects across the product lifecycle, aligning with the organization's environmental policy and relevant legislation like RoHS and WE. Explanation: the scope of an environmental management system, particularly when integrating environmental aspects into product design and development, as per ISO 14009-2020, defines the boundaries within which the system operates. This includes the products and services that the organization designs and develops, the organizational units involved in these activities, and the life cycle stages that are considered. For an internal auditor, understanding the defined scope is crucial for planning and conducting effective audits. The scope dictates which processes, products, and organizational functions will be examined. If the scope is too narrow, critical environmental aspects related to product design might be missed. If it's too broad without justification, the audit may become inefficient. ISO 14009-2020 emphasizes considering the entire product life cycle, from raw material acquisition to end-of-life treatment, within the scope of design integration. Therefore, an auditor must verify that the scope is clearly defined, documented, and encompasses all relevant product design and development activities, including their associated environmental aspects and impacts, and that it aligns with the organization's policy and objectives. The scope also needs to consider external and internal issues relevant to product design, such as regulatory requirements like the EU's Restriction of Hazardous Substances, RoHS, directive, or the Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment, WEEE directive, which directly influence design choices. Question 8. When auditing a company's product design and development process against ISO 14009-2020, which of the following auditor actions would best verify the effective integration of waste reduction and recycling principles into the design phase, considering potential legislative requirements like the EU's Waste Framework Directive that encourages the waste hierarchy? Option A. Inspecting the manufacturing floor to count the volume of waste generated during the production of a specific product. Option B. Reviewing design documentation and material specifications for explicit criteria related to waste minimization, recyclability, and the use of recycled content. Option C. Examining the company's financial records for expenses related to waste disposal and recycling services. Option D. Interviewing the marketing department about their communication strategies regarding the product's environmental attributes. Correct answer is B. Reviewing design documentation and material specifications for explicit criteria related to waste minimization, recyclability, and the use of recycled content. Explanation. The core principle of ISO 14009-2020 regarding waste reduction and recycling within product design and development is to systematically identify opportunities to minimize waste generation throughout the product lifecycle, from raw material extraction to end of life. This involves a proactive approach to design choices that favor materials with higher recyclability, design for disassembly to facilitate material recovery, and the selection of manufacturing processes that inherently produce less waste. An internal auditor assessing compliance with this guideline would look for evidence of a structured process for evaluating waste streams associated with product design and development activities, not just manufacturing. This includes considering the waste generated during prototyping, testing, and even the potential for waste reduction in packaging and distribution. Furthermore, the guideline emphasizes the integration of these considerations into the early stages of design, rather than treating waste management as a post-design problem. Therefore, the most effective approach for an auditor to verify the integration of waste reduction and recycling into product design and development, as per ISO 14009-2020, is to examine the design specifications and material selection criteria for evidence of these principles being actively applied and documented, ensuring that waste minimization is a design input. This aligns with the standard's focus on preventing environmental impacts at the source. Question 9. During an internal audit of a company's product design and development process, an auditor is evaluating the methodology used to determine the significance of environmental aspects identified for a new line of electronic devices. The company has identified potential aspects such as energy consumption during use, material selection for casing, and end-of-life recyclability. The auditor needs to ascertain if the company's significance determination process adequately considers regulatory compliance and potential long-term environmental consequences, in line with ISO 14009-2020 principles. Which of the following approaches would best demonstrate an auditor's critical assessment of the company's significance determination for these aspects? Option A. Reviewing the product development team's internal meeting minutes to ensure that environmental aspects were discussed at least once during the conceptualization phase. Option B. Checking if the company has conducted a detailed life cycle assessment, LCA, for the new electronic device, focusing solely on quantifiable resource depletion metrics. Option C. Confirming that the company has documented a list of all environmental aspects identified throughout the product's life cycle, regardless of their potential impact magnitude. Option D. Verifying that the company's significance criteria explicitly incorporate the severity of potential environmental impacts, the probability of their occurrence, relevant legal and other requirements, such as those pertaining to hazardous substances or end-of-life management, and the organization's stated environmental objectives and policy. The correct answer is D. Verifying that the company's significance criteria explicitly incorporate the severity of potential environmental impacts, the the probability of their occurrence, relevant legal and other requirements, such as those pertaining to hazardous substances or end-of-life management, and the organization's stated environmental objectives and policy. Explanation: ISO 14009-2020 provides guidance on integrating environmental aspects into product design and development. A crucial part of this process, especially for an internal auditor, is evaluating the significance of these environmental aspects. Significance is not solely determined by the magnitude of the impact, but also by its context and potential consequences. When assessing significance, an auditor must consider factors such as the severity of the impact, the likelihood of its occurrence, regulatory requirements, e.g., adherence to REACH regulations concerning chemical substances or directives like the Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment, WEEE, directive concerning end-of-life management, stakeholder concerns, and the organization's environmental policy and objectives. The approach to determining significance should be systematic, often involving a matrix or scoring system that weighs these different criteria. For instance, an aspect with a low potential impact but a high likelihood of occurrence and a direct contravention of a stringent environmental law would likely be deemed significant. Conversely, an aspect with a moderate impact but a very low likelihood and no regulatory implications might be considered less significant. The auditor's role is to verify that the organization's methodology for determining significance is robust, consistently applied, and aligned with the overall environmental management system. This involves reviewing documented criteria, evidence of their application, and the rationale behind classifying certain aspects as significant or not. The process should also consider the entire life cycle of the product, from raw material acquisition to disposal. Question 10. When conducting an internal audit of a company's product design and development process for compliance with ISO 14009-2020, what is the most critical aspect to assess regarding the environmental inventory analysis phase to ensure it effectively informs eco-design principles? Option A: the number of environmental aspects identified during the initial screening phase of the inventory analysis, irrespective of their significance or the depth of the subsequent quantitative assessment. Option B: the comprehensiveness of the database used for the inventory analysis, ensuring it includes a wide range of chemical substances and their associated environmental hazard classifications, regardless of their relevance to the product's intended function. Option C: the extent to which the inventory analysis quantifies and characterizes the environmental impacts of selected materials and components across their life cycle, and how these findings are systematically translated into design specifications and material selection criteria to achieve specific environmental improvement objectives. Option D: the inclusion of detailed end-of-life scenarios in the inventory analysis, such as waste management practices in specific regions, without a concurrent evaluation of the upstream impacts of material sourcing and manufacturing processes. The correct answer is C: the extent to which the inventory analysis quantifies and characterizes the environmental impacts of selected materials and components across their life cycle, and how these findings are systematically translated into design specifications and material selection criteria to achieve specific environmental improvement objectives. Explanation: the core of an inventory analysis for integrating environmental aspects into product design and development, as guided by ISO 14009-2020, involves identifying and characterizing the environmental impacts associated with materials, components, and processes throughout the product lifecycle. This analysis is not merely a list of substances, but a systematic evaluation of how these elements contribute to environmental burdens. For an internal auditor, understanding the depth of this analysis is crucial. It requires examining how the organization has moved beyond basic material declarations to consider the upstream and downstream implications, such as resource depletion, energy consumption during extraction and manufacturing, emissions during use, and end-of-life scenarios like recyclability or biodegradability. A robust inventory analysis will inform design decisions aimed at mitigation. For instance, if the analysis reveals significant greenhouse gas emissions associated with a particular raw material's production, the design team might explore alternative materials with lower carbon footprints, or redesign the product to reduce the quantity of that material used. Similarly, If the analysis highlights issues with the disposal of a specific component, design for disassembly, or the use of more readily recyclable materials would be considered. The auditor's role is to verify that this analysis is comprehensive, accurate, and actively used to drive environmentally preferable design choices, aligning with the principles of eco-design and circular economy concepts that ISO 14009 promotes. The effectiveness of the inventory analysis is measured by its direct influence on reducing the environmental profile of the product. Question 11. An internal auditor is reviewing the environmental management system for a company that designs and manufactures advanced electronic components. The company has developed an environmental management plan, EMP, specifically for its product design and development processes, aiming to comply with ISO 14009-2020 guidelines. During the audit, the auditor finds that while the EMP outlines general environmental objectives for product design, it lacks specific, measurable criteria for evaluating the environmental performance of new component designs against established benchmarks or legal requirements, such as the EU's restriction of hazardous substances, RoHS, directive. Which aspect of the EMP's development is most critically deficient in this scenario, hindering its effectiveness in guiding compliant and sustainable product design? Option A. Insufficiently detailed integration of quantitative environmental performance indicators and compliance checks within the EMP for design stages. Option B. Overemphasis on qualitative descriptions of environmental benefits without actionable mitigation strategies. Option C. Lack of a dedicated section within the EMP addressing end-of-life product management and recycling. Option D. Inadequate stakeholder consultation during the initial development of the EMP for product design. The correct answer is A. Insufficiently detailed integration of quantitative environmental performance indicators and compliance checks within the EMP for design stages. Explanation: the core principle of developing an environmental management plan, EMP, for product design and development, as guided by ISO 14009-2020, is to proactively identify, assess, and manage environmental aspects throughout the product lifecycle. This involves integrating environmental considerations from the initial concept phase through to end-of-life management. For an internal auditor examining this process, the focus should be on the robustness and effectiveness of the methods used to embed these considerations. A key element is ensuring that the EMP is not merely a static document, but a dynamic tool that influences design decisions. This includes the systematic identification of potential environmental impacts, such as resource depletion, emissions, and waste generation. At each stage of the product's existence, the EMP should outline specific controls and mitigation measures to minimize these impacts. Furthermore, it must define clear responsibilities, establish monitoring and review mechanisms, and ensure that the environmental performance objectives are aligned with the organization's overall environmental policy and legal obligations, such as those related to extended producer responsibility or chemical substance restrictions. The auditor's evaluation would therefore center on how well the EMP guides the incorporation of life cycle thinking and drives continuous improvement in the environmental performance of the design products. Question 12. During an internal audit of a company manufacturing advanced composite materials, an auditor is assessing the integration of environmental aspects identified during product design into the production phase, as per ISO 14009-2020. The design team specified the use of a novel bio-based resin to reduce the embodied carbon of the final product. The production team, however, has encountered difficulties in achieving consistent curing times with this resin, leading to increased energy consumption for extended oven cycles and higher scrap rates due to material defects. What is the most critical area for the auditor to focus on to ensure effective integration of the environmental aspect into manufacturing and production, considering the potential non-compliance with the intended environmental performance? Option A. Assessment of the waste management procedures for the scrap materials generated during the curing process, focusing solely on their disposal in accordance with local landfill regulations. Option B. Examination of the procurement records for the bio-based resin to ensure it meets the specifications provided by the design team, irrespective of its performance in the manufacturing process. Option C. Review of the marketing materials that highlight the use of the bio-based resin, ensuring they accurately reflect the product's environmental benefits as intended by the design phase. Option D. Verification that the production process parameters have been adjusted and validated to accommodate the bio-based resin, ensuring it meets the design's environmental performance objectives without compromising product quality, and that any deviations are documented and addressed through a corrective action process. The correct answer is D. Verification that the production process parameters have been adjusted and validated to accommodate the bio-based resin, ensuring it meets the design's environmental performance objectives without compromising product quality, and that any deviations are documented and addressed through a corrective action process. Explanation. The core principle of ISO 14009/2020 concerning manufacturing and production is the proactive integration of environmental considerations throughout the product lifecycle, starting from the design phase. For an internal auditor, assessing the effectiveness of this integration requires understanding how environmental aspects identified during design are translated into tangible production processes and controls. This involves verifying that manufacturing operations are aligned with the environmental objectives and targets established earlier. For instance, if a design phase identified a reduction in volatile organic compound (VOC) emissions as a key environmental aspect, the auditor must confirm that the chosen manufacturing processes, such as painting or coating, are selected to minimize VOCs, and that appropriate controls like ventilation and capture systems are in place and functioning as intended. Furthermore, the auditor would examine records of material usage, waste generation, and energy consumption during production, comparing them against the design specifications and established environmental performance indicators. The auditor's role is to ensure that the design for environment principles are not merely theoretical, but are operationalized and continuously monitored within the manufacturing environment. This includes checking for compliance with relevant environmental legislation, such as the Clean Air Act or waste management regulations, which may dictate specific emission limits or disposal methods that must be adhered to in production. The auditor also looks for evidence of continuous improvement, such as process modifications made to further reduce environmental impact based on production data or feedback. Question 13. During an internal audit of a company's product development process, which of the following actions by the auditor would most effectively verify the integration of environmental aspects into product design, in accordance with ISO 14009/2020 guidelines, considering the need to address potential impacts from raw material extraction to end-of-life disposal and relevant legislative frameworks like the EU's Waste Framework Directive? Option A. Reviewing design specifications and material selection criteria to confirm that potential environmental impacts identified during the life cycle assessment (LCA) phase have been systematically addressed and mitigated through design choices, with documented evidence of compliance with relevant environmental legislation. Option B. Interviewing the sales team to gauge their understanding of the product's environmental features and their ability to respond to customer inquiries regarding its ecological footprint. Option C. Examining the company's marketing materials to assess how environmental benefits of the product are communicated to customers, ensuring accuracy and avoiding greenwashing claims. Option D. Verifying that the company has obtained all necessary environmental permits for its manufacturing facilities involved in producing the product, as stipulated by local environmental protection agencies. Correct answer is A. Reviewing design specifications and material selection criteria to confirm that potential environmental impacts identified during the life cycle assessment (LCA) phase have been systematically addressed and mitigated through design choices, with documented evidence of compliance with relevant environmental legislation. Explanation. The core principle of integrating environmental aspects into product design and development, as guided by ISO 14009/2020, involves a proactive approach to minimizing environmental impacts throughout the product lifecycle. This means considering environmental performance from the initial concept stage through to end-of-life management. A key aspect of this integration is the systematic identification and evaluation of environmental aspects associated with the product. This involves understanding how the product, its manufacturing, its use, and its disposal might interact with the environment. For example, the energy consumption during product use, the materials used in its construction, and the potential for recycling or safe disposal are all critical environmental aspects. The guidelines emphasize that this process should be informed by relevant legislation and standards. When auditing such a system, an internal auditor would look for evidence that these environmental aspects have been systematically identified, assessed for their significance, and that design decisions are made to mitigate or prevent negative impacts. This includes ensuring that the design process incorporates mechanisms for addressing regulatory compliance, such as waste management directives or material restrictions, and that these considerations are documented and reviewed. The objective is to achieve environmental improvements by embedding environmental thinking into the very fabric of product creation, rather than treating it as an afterthought. Question 14. An internal auditor is evaluating the effectiveness of a company's product development process for adherence to ISO 14009-2020 guidelines, with a particular focus on the integration of design for environment, DFE principles. The company has a policy statement that acknowledges the importance of environmental considerations in design. During the audit, the auditor reviews the project documentation for a new electronic device and notes that environmental impact assessments are conducted only after the primary design specifications have been finalized. Which of the following audit findings would most accurately reflect a deficiency in the systematic integration of DFE principles as per ISO 14009-2020? Option A. The audit noted that the final product design did not incorporate any recycled materials, despite the company's stated commitment to sustainability in its marketing materials. Option B. The audit identified that the company's general environmental policy statement did not explicitly mention the concept of cradle-to-grave environmental responsibility for products. Option C. The audit revealed that the product development team had not conducted a formal risk assessment specifically for potential environmental hazards associated with the product's use phase. Option D. The audit found that environmental impact assessments were performed late in the design cycle, potentially limiting the influence of DFE considerations on fundamental design choices and material selection. The correct answer is D. The audit found that environmental impact assessments were performed late in the design cycle, potentially limiting the influence of DFE considerations on fundamental design choices and material selection. Explanation. The question probes the auditor's understanding of how to assess the integration of design for environment, DFE, principles within a product development process, specifically in relation to ISO 14009-2020. ISO 14009 emphasizes a life cycle perspective for environmental management and product design. When auditing the integration of DFE, an internal auditor must verify that environmental considerations are systematically embedded throughout the design and development stages, not merely as an afterthought. This involves evaluating the tools, methodologies, and decision-making processes used to identify and mitigate potential environmental impacts. The standard encourages proactive measures to reduce environmental burdens from raw material extraction, manufacturing, distribution, use, and end-of-life management. Therefore, an auditor would look for evidence of how environmental performance indicators are defined and measured against design requirements, how trade-offs between environmental performance and other factors, like cost or functionality, are managed, and how feedback from life cycle assessments or environmental impact analyses informs design iterations. The most effective way to audit this integration is to examine the documented design and development procedures and verify their practical application through interviews and review of project records. Specifically, the auditor needs to confirm that the organization has established a systematic approach to incorporate DFE principles, which includes defining environmental criteria, evaluating design alternatives against these criteria, and ensuring these considerations influence final design decisions. This systematic verification, rather than just a review of general environmental policies or a single design review, provides assurance that DFE is a functional part of the product development lifecycle. Question 15. When auditing a company's product design and development process for compliance with ISO 14009-2020 guidelines, specifically concerning the integration of environmental aspects with the organization's environmental policy, What is the primary indicator that the design team is effectively translating policy commitments into actionable design criteria? Option A. Design reviews explicitly document the consideration of specific environmental policy statements and their influence on material selection, energy efficiency targets, and end-of-life management strategies. Option B. Environmental performance metrics for products are tracked and reported annually, with no direct linkage to the initial design phase or policy objectives. Option C. The product development team primarily relies on customer feedback to identify and address environmental concerns during the design phase. Option D. The company has established a dedicated green design department that independently verifies all design outputs against external environmental standards. The correct answer is A. Design reviews explicitly document the consideration of specific environmental policy statements and their influence on material selection, energy efficiency targets, and end-of-life management strategies. Explanation: the core principle of aligning product design and development with an organization's environmental policy, as guided by ISO 14009-2020, is to ensure that environmental considerations are integrated from the earliest stages. This involves a systematic approach to identifying, evaluating, and mitigating potential environmental impacts throughout the product lifecycle. An internal auditor's role is to verify that this integration is effective and demonstrably linked to the overarching environmental policy. The policy sets the strategic direction and commitments, such as reducing waste, conserving resources, or minimizing pollution. Therefore, the design and development process must translate these policy commitments into tangible actions and design choices. For instance, if the policy commits to reducing the use of hazardous substances, the design team must actively seek and implement alternatives during the material selection phase. Similarly, if resource efficiency is a policy objective, design choices should prioritize durability, repairability, and energy efficiency. The auditor must assess whether the documented environmental policy is the foundational document that informs and drives the environmental objectives and targets set for product design, and subsequently, whether the design outputs reflect these objectives. This means looking for evidence of policy review influencing design criteria, environmental impact assessments being conducted against policy goals, and design reviews explicitly considering the alignment with the stated environmental policy. The effectiveness of this alignment is measured by the extent to which the product's environmental performance contributes to achieving the organization's overall environmental policy commitments. Question 16. During an internal audit of a company's product design and development process, an auditor is evaluating the integration of environmental aspects as per ISO 14009-2020. The company has developed a new line of portable electronic devices. The auditor reviews the design documentation and interview notes from the development team. The team identified that the manufacturing process for a specific component requires a high-temperature smelting process, potentially leading to significant energy consumption and air emissions. They also noted that the device's battery is not easily replaceable, which might lead to premature disposal of the entire unit when the battery degrades. Which of the following best represents the auditor's finding regarding the effectiveness of the environmental aspect integration in this scenario? Option A. The integration of environmental aspects is considered complete because the manufacturing energy use and battery disposability were noted, fulfilling the basic requirement of aspect identification. Option B. The auditor has concluded that the company's approach is flawed as it relies on future iterations for mitigation, indicating a lack of immediate action to address the identified environmental aspects during the current design phase. Option C. The design team has identified significant environmental aspects related to energy consumption and end-of-life disposal due to battery design, and these have been documented for potential mitigation in future design iterations. Option D. The environmental aspects identified are superficial and do not address the full life cycle impact, as the team has not quantified the precise emissions from the smelting process or explored alternative battery chemistries. The correct answer is C. The design team has identified significant environmental aspects related to energy consumption and end-of-life disposal due to battery design, and these have been documented for potential mitigation in future design iterations. Explanation: the core principle of integrating environmental aspects into product design and development, as guided by ISO 14009-2020, involves a proactive approach to identifying and managing potential environmental consequences throughout a product's lifecycle. When auditing a company's implementation of this standard, an internal auditor must assess the effectiveness of the methodologies used to identify these aspects and their associated impacts. The standard emphasizes a life cycle perspective, meaning that environmental considerations should span from raw material extraction and manufacturing to use and end-of-life disposal or recycling. The auditor needs to verify that the organization's process for identifying environmental aspects is systematic, comprehensive, and considers all relevant stages of the product's existence. This involves reviewing documentation, interviewing personnel involved in design and development, and examining records of environmental reviews conducted during the design process. The auditor's objective is to confirm that the identified aspects are directly linked to potential environmental impacts, and that these are then used to inform design decisions aimed at reducing the overall environmental footprint. A key indicator of effective integration is the demonstrable use of this information to make design choices that mitigate significant environmental impacts, such as reducing energy consumption during use, minimizing waste generation during manufacturing, or facilitating easier disassembly and recycling at end of life. The auditor must also ensure that the methodology employed is robust enough to capture both direct and indirect environmental aspects that might arise from the product's intended use or foreseeable misuse. For instance, if a product's design leads to the emission of volatile organic compounds during its operational phase, this would be a significant environmental aspect to identify and manage. The process should also consider regulatory requirements and stakeholder expectations. The most effective integration involves a clear linkage between identified aspects, their potential impacts, and the subsequent design modifications or controls implemented to prevent or minimize these impacts. Question 17. During an internal audit of a manufacturing firm's product development process, an auditor is reviewing the environmental targets set for a new line of biodegradable packaging. The development team has proposed the target to significantly improve the environmental performance of our packaging materials. As an internal auditor focusing on ISO 14009-2020 compliance, what is the most critical deficiency in this target from an audit perspective? Option A. The target fails to address the entire product lifecycle, focusing only on end of life. Option B. The target lacks specific quantifiable metrics and a defined timeframe for achievement. Option C. The target does not explicitly mention compliance with relevant national waste management regulations. Option D. The target is too ambitious given the current technological capabilities in biodegradable materials. The correct answer is B. The target lacks specific, quantifiable metrics and a defined timeframe for achievement. Explanation: ISO 14009-2020 provides guidance on integrating environmental aspects into product design and development. A key element of this is setting measurable targets to drive improvement. When auditing the effectiveness of such targets within a product development lifecycle, an internal auditor must assess whether the targets are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound, SMART. The principle behind setting these targets is to ensure they are quantifiable and allow for objective evaluation of progress. For instance, if a company aims to reduce the embodied energy of a new electronic device, a poorly defined target might be reduce energy consumption. Well-defined, measurable target, however, would be reduce the total embodied energy per functional unit of the new Aura Smart Speaker by 15% compared to the previous model by the end of fiscal year 2025, measured using the life cycle assessment methodology outlined in ISO 14044. This level of specificity, including a baseline, a percentage reduction, a clear metric, a defined product, and a timeframe, allows for robust auditing. The auditor would then verify the data collection, calculation methods, and reporting to confirm achievement. The focus is on the quantifiable nature of the target and its link to a specific environmental aspect within the product's lifecycle, ensuring accountability and facilitating continuous improvement as per the principles of environmental management systems. Question 18. During an internal audit of a manufacturing firm's product design and development process, which approach would most effectively verify the organization's adherence to the life cycle perspective as mandated by ISO 14009-2020, ensuring environmental aspects are systematically integrated from concept to end of life. Option A. Interviewing the product development team to gauge their awareness of life cycle thinking and environmental considerations. Option B. Reviewing design and development documentation to identify explicit linkages between design decisions and environmental performance objectives across the product lifecycle. Option C. Examining the company's environmental policy for statements related to product design and lifecycle management. Option D. Assessing the number of environmental impact assessments conducted for new product prototypes. Correct answer is B. Reviewing design and development documentation to identify explicit linkages between design decisions and environmental performance objectives across the product lifecycle. Explanation. The question probes the understanding of how an internal auditor for ISO 14009-2020 would verify the effectiveness of integrating environmental aspects into product design and development, specifically focusing on the lifecycle perspective. ISO 14009-2020 emphasizes a life cycle approach, meaning that environmental impacts are considered from raw material acquisition through end-of-life treatment. For an auditor, verifying this integration requires examining evidence that demonstrates this consideration at various stages. This includes reviewing design specifications, material selection criteria, manufacturing process considerations, and end-of-life planning, all of which should reflect environmental performance objectives. The auditor would look for documented evidence of how environmental considerations influence decisions during the design and development process, such as the selection of lower-impact materials, design for disassembly, or the reduction of energy consumption during use. The most comprehensive way to assess this is by reviewing the documented design and development records that explicitly link design choices to environmental performance improvements or impact mitigation across the product's lifecycle. This aligns with the standard's intent to embed environmental considerations throughout the product's journey. Question 19. During an internal audit of an organization's environmental management system, focusing on ISO 14009-2020 guidelines for integrating environmental aspects into product design and development, an auditor is examining the process for a new electronic device. The organization claims to have a robust system for addressing environmental impacts. What specific evidence would an internal auditor most critically seek to confirm the effective integration of environmental aspects into the product design phase, as per the standard's intent? Option A. Records of customer complaints related to the environmental impact of previously released products. Option B. Documented design reviews that explicitly evaluate the environmental performance of material choices and end-of-life recyclability for the electronic device. Option C. A comprehensive list of all environmental regulations applicable to electronic devices, regardless of their incorporation into the design process. Option D. The final marketing brochure for the electronic device, highlighting its green features without detailing the design integration process. The correct answer is B. Documented design reviews that explicitly evaluate the environmental performance of material choices and end-of-life recyclability for the electronic device. Explanation. The core of ISO 14009-2020 is about proactively integrating environmental considerations throughout a product's lifecycle, starting from the design and development phase. This proactive approach aims to minimize environmental impacts by making informed decisions early on. The concept of eco-design is central, which involves considering factors like material selection, energy efficiency during use, and end-of-life management. An internal auditor's role is to verify that an organization's environmental management system, EMS, effectively incorporates these principles. When assessing the integration of environmental aspects into product design, an auditor would look for evidence that potential environmental impacts of design choices have been systematically identified, evaluated, and addressed. This includes reviewing design specifications, material lists, and any environmental assessments conducted during the development process. The auditor would also check if the organization has established procedures to ensure that environmental performance is a criterion in design decisions, similar to cost or functionality. The aim is to ensure that the EMS drives continuous improvement in product environmental performance by embedding these considerations into the very fabric of product creation, rather than treating them as an afterthought. This aligns with the broader goals of environmental management systems to prevent pollution and improve environmental performance. Question 20. When conducting an internal audit of an organization's product design and development process, specifically concerning the integration of environmental aspects as guided by ISO 14009-2020, what is the most effective method for an auditor to verify that stakeholder input has been meaningfully incorporated into design decisions and environmental performance objectives? Option A. Reviewing documented evidence of how specific stakeholder concerns and feedback have demonstrably influenced design iterations and the establishment of environmental performance targets. Option B. Examining the organization's publicly available sustainability reports to gauge general stakeholder satisfaction with their environmental performance. Option C. Confirming that a list of potential stakeholders has been compiled and that meetings have been held with representatives from various stakeholder groups. Option D. Assessing the number of environmental impact assessments conducted during the product development lifecycle, irrespective of stakeholder involvement. The correct answer is A. Reviewing documented evidence of how specific stakeholder concerns and feedback have demonstrably influenced design iterations and the establishment of environmental performance targets. Explanation. ISO 14009-2020, specifically in its guidelines for integrating environmental aspects into product design and development, emphasizes proactive engagement with stakeholders to identify and address potential environmental impacts throughout a product's lifecycle. This engagement is crucial for gathering diverse perspectives, understanding regulatory expectations, and fostering collaboration towards sustainable product solutions. When an internal auditor is assessing the effectiveness of this integration process, they must evaluate how the organization systematically identifies relevant stakeholders and incorporates their input into design decisions. This involves more than just a one-time consultation. It requires an ongoing dialogue and a mechanism for feedback to be translated into actionable design changes. The auditor would look for evidence of a structured approach to stakeholder identification, considering groups such as regulatory bodies, non-governmental organizations, end users, suppliers, and even local communities potentially affected by the product or its life cycle stages. The ultimate goal is to ensure that the environmental considerations derived from stakeholder input are genuinely embedded within the product development lifecycle, influencing material selection, manufacturing processes, product use, and end-of-life management. Therefore, the most effective approach for an internal auditor to verify this integration is to examine the documented evidence of how stakeholder input has demonstrably influenced design choices and environmental performance objectives, ensuring that these inputs are not merely collected but actively utilized to drive improvements and meet environmental commitments. Question 21. An internal auditor is assessing the effectiveness of a company's product redesign initiative aimed at reducing its environmental footprint, as per ISO 14009-2020 guidelines. The company has gathered extensive data on material usage, energy consumption during manufacturing, transportation emissions, and end-of-life recyclability for both the original and redesigned product, which data analysis technique would provide the most comprehensive and scientifically defensible evaluation of the redesign's overall environmental performance improvement. Option A. Conducting a comparative life cycle assessment, LCA, to quantify environmental impacts across all life cycle stages for both product versions. Option B. Utilizing life cycle costing to evaluate the economic benefits associated with the material changes, inferring environmental improvements. Option C. Performing a simple trend analysis on the primary raw material consumption data to identify reduction percentages. Option D. Analyzing stakeholder feedback surveys to gauge customer perception of the product's environmental attributes following the redesign. The correct answer is A. Conducting a comparative life cycle assessment, LCA, to quantify environmental impacts across all life cycle stages for both product versions. Explanation. The core principle of integrating environmental aspects into product design and development, as guided by ISO 14009-2020, necessitates a systematic approach to data collection and analysis. When evaluating the effectiveness of an organization's product environmental performance improvement initiatives, an internal auditor must consider the methodologies used to gather and interpret data related to these initiatives. The question probes the auditor's understanding of appropriate data analysis techniques for such evaluations. Life cycle assessment, LCA, is a well-established methodology for assessing the environmental impacts of a product throughout its entire life cycle, from raw material extraction to end-of-life disposal. When used to analyze the data collected on an improved product's environmental performance compared to a baseline, LCA provides a comprehensive and scientifically sound basis for demonstrating the efficacy of design changes. This involves quantifying inputs and outputs at each stage and translating them into potential environmental impacts. Therefore, using LCA results to validate claims of reduced environmental impact from product redesign is a robust analytical technique aligned with the principles of ISO 14009. Other methods, while potentially useful for specific data points, do not offer the holistic view required for a thorough evaluation of product environmental performance improvements across the entire life cycle. For instance, simple trend analysis of a single material input might not capture trade-offs or impacts in other life cycle stages. Life cycle costing, while valuable for economic considerations, is not primarily an environmental impact analysis tool. A stakeholder perception survey, while informative for communication, is subjective and does not provide objective, quantifiable environmental performance data. Question 22. An internal auditor is evaluating an organization's adherence to ISO 14009-2020 guidelines concerning the reporting of environmental performance data generated during the product design and development phases. The organization has produced extensive reports detailing material sourcing impacts, energy efficiency metrics for prototypes, and projected end-of-life waste streams for a new consumer electronics device. Which of the following represents the most critical criterion for the auditor to assess when determining the effectiveness of this reporting system in supporting the integration of environmental aspects into the product's life cycle? Option A. The sheer volume and detail of the environmental data collected and presented in the reports, indicating a comprehensive data gathering approach. Option B. The frequency with which these environmental performance reports are disseminated internally, regardless of the actionable insights they contain. Option C. The extent to which the reported environmental performance data has demonstrably informed and influenced decisions made during the product design and development process, leading to tangible environmental improvements. Option D. The use of sophisticated data visualization techniques and statistical analyses within the reports to present the environmental performance metrics. The correct answer is C. The extent to which the reported environmental performance data has demonstrably informed and influenced decisions made during the product design and development process, leading to tangible environmental improvements. Explanation. The core principle of reporting environmental performance within the framework of ISO 14009-2020 is to ensure that the information provided is relevant, accurate, and facilitates informed decision-making for integrating environmental considerations into product design and development. Clause 7.4 of ISO 14009-2020 emphasizes the importance of communication regarding environmental aspects. When an internal auditor reviews the reporting of environmental performance related to product design, they must verify that the reported data supports the organization's objectives for environmental improvement throughout the product lifecycle. This involves assessing whether the reports clearly articulate the environmental impacts identified during the design and development phases, such as material selection, energy consumption during use, and end-of-life disposal. Furthermore, the auditor needs to confirm that these reports are communicated to relevant stakeholders, including design teams, management, and potentially external parties, in a manner that enables them to take appropriate actions. The effectiveness of the reporting system is measured by its contribution to achieving these integration goals, not merely by the volume of data presented or the frequency of reporting. Therefore, the most critical aspect for an internal auditor to assess is the demonstrable link between the reported environmental performance data and the actual improvements or decisions made in the product design and development process, ensuring that the reporting directly supports the strategic integration of environmental aspects. Question 23. During an internal audit of a company's product design and development process, an auditor is examining the integration of environmental aspects related to packaging and distribution for a new line of electronic devices. The company has opted for a lightweight, recycled content cardboard packaging and a consolidated shipping strategy utilizing electric vehicles for last-mile delivery. Which of the following internal audit findings will most accurately reflect a robust implementation of ISO 14009-2020 principles concerning these elements? Option A. Evidence of a documented life cycle assessment, LCA, for the packaging materials and distribution routes, demonstrating a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and resource depletion compared to previous product iterations. Option B. A report detailing the cost savings achieved through the new packaging and distribution methods. Option C. A supplier survey indicating a high satisfaction rate with the new packaging's durability during transit. Option D. Confirmation that the packaging meets all mandatory regulatory requirements for recyclability in the primary markets. The correct answer is A. Evidence of a documented life cycle assessment, LCA, for the packaging materials and distribution routes, demonstrating a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and resource depletion compared to previous product iterations. Explanation: the core principle of integrating environmental aspects into product design and development, as guided by ISO 14009-2020, necessitates a holistic life cycle approach. When considering packaging and distribution, an internal auditor must evaluate how these elements contribute to the overall environmental footprint of a product. This involves examining material selection for packaging, considering recyclability, reusability, and the embodied energy of the materials. Furthermore, the auditor must assess the efficiency of distribution networks, including transportation modes, route optimization, and the potential for consolidation of shipments. The auditor's role is to verify that the organization has established processes to identify and manage environmental aspects throughout the product's lifecycle, from raw material acquisition to end of life. This includes ensuring that decisions made during the design phase regarding packaging and distribution are informed by environmental considerations, aligning with the organization's environmental policy and objectives. For instance, an auditor would look for evidence of design reviews that specifically address the environmental impacts of packaging choices, such as minimizing material usage or selecting biodegradable alternatives, and how these choices are justified in relation to their life cycle environmental performance. The auditor also verifies compliance with relevant legislation, such as waste reduction mandates or regulations concerning packaging materials, which are crucial for demonstrating an effective environmental management system in practice. Question 24. During an internal audit of a company's product design and development process, an auditor is reviewing the implementation of its environmental management program, EMP, in accordance with ISO 14009-2020. The auditor has identified that while the EMP outlines numerous environmental objectives related to product material selection and end-of-life management, there is a lack of documented evidence demonstrating how these objectives are being systematically translated into specific design requirements and how their achievement is being tracked during the product development lifecycle. Which of the following actions by the auditor would best assess the effectiveness of the EMP's implementation in this scenario? Option A. Assessing the training records of the product development team to confirm they have received general environmental awareness training. Option B. Inquiring with the R&D department about their general understanding of the company's commitment to reducing its environmental footprint. Option C. Examining design, review meeting minutes and project documentation to verify if environmental objectives are explicitly discussed, assigned responsibilities, and incorporated into design specifications and performance criteria. Option D. Reviewing the company's waste management records to ascertain if the quantity of waste generated during product prototyping aligns with the EMP's waste reduction targets. The correct answer is C. Examining design, review meeting minutes and project documentation to verify if environmental objectives are explicitly discussed, assigned responsibilities, and incorporated into design specifications and performance criteria. Explanation: the core of implementing environmental management programs, EMP, within product design and development, as guided by ISO 14009-2020, hinges on establishing clear, measurable, and achievable environmental objectives and targets. These objectives must be directly linked to significant environmental aspects identified throughout the product lifecycle, from raw material extraction to end-of-life disposal. For an internal auditor, verifying the effectiveness of an EMP requires assessing how well these objectives translate into actionable plans and how progress is monitored. The process involves reviewing documented procedures, performance data, and evidence of corrective actions. For instance, if a significant environmental aspect identified is energy consumption during product use, a corresponding objective might be to reduce average energy consumption by 15% over 3 years. The EMP would then detail specific design strategies, material choices, and testing protocols to achieve this. An auditor would examine design specifications, energy efficiency test reports, and any deviations from the planned reduction, probing the root causes and the effectiveness of implemented mitigation measures. This systematic approach ensures that the EMP is not merely a compliance document, but a dynamic tool driving continuous environmental improvement in product development. The auditor's role is to confirm that the organization has a robust system for setting, monitoring, and reviewing these objectives, ensuring they are aligned with the overall environmental policy and the organization's commitment to sustainability. Question 25. An internal auditor is reviewing an organization's compliance with ISO 14009-2020 guidelines for integrating environmental aspects into product design and development. The organization manufactures electronic devices and has implemented a system to track the energy consumption of its products during the use phase. During the audit, the auditor finds that while energy consumption data is collected, the organization has not established specific, quantifiable targets for reducing this consumption across its product lines, nor has it defined a systematic process for using this data to inform future design iterations to achieve environmental performance improvements. Which aspect of evaluating environmental performance, as per ISO 14009-2020, is most critically deficient in this scenario? Option A. The absence of clearly defined and measurable performance indicators linked to product environmental aspects and a systematic approach to utilize performance data for continuous improvement in design. Option B. The lack of a documented environmental policy that explicitly mentions the reduction of energy consumption in electronic products during their use phase. Option C. The non-compliance with specific national regulations regarding the labeling of energy efficiency for electronic devices sold within the domestic market. Option D. The failure to conduct comprehensive life cycle assessments for all new product developments, which is a mandatory requirement for environmental performance evaluation. The correct answer is A. The absence of clearly defined and measurable performance indicators linked to product environmental aspects and a systematic approach to utilize performance data for continuous improvement in design. Explanation. The internal auditor's role in evaluating an organization's environmental performance, particularly concerning product design and development according to ISO 14009-2020, requires a focus on how effectively the organization has integrated environmental considerations throughout the product lifecycle. This involves assessing the establishment and application of criteria for evaluating environmental performance. Such criteria should be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound, SMART, and directly linked to the organization's environmental policy and objectives. For product design and development, this translates to evaluating the effectiveness of methods used to identify and assess environmental aspects of products, such as life cycle assessment, LCA, or eco-design checklists. The auditor must verify if the organization has set performance indicators, KPI, related to design choices, material selection, energy efficiency during use, and end-of-life management. Furthermore, the auditor checks if the organization monitors these KPIs, analyzes the data to identify trends and areas for improvement, and takes corrective actions when performance deviates from targets. The evaluation must also consider the alignment of these performance metrics with legal and other requirements applicable to the product and its intended markets, such as regulations on hazardous substances or recyclability. The effectiveness of the management review process in utilizing this performance data to drive strategic decisions regarding product development and environmental improvement, is also a key audit point. Question 26. During an internal audit of a company designing new portable electronic devices, the auditor is reviewing the process for identifying and evaluating the significance of environmental aspects related to the product's life cycle. The company has identified several aspects, including the use of rare earth minerals in components, energy consumption during product use, and the generation of e-waste at end of life. The auditor needs to determine if the company's methodology for assessing the significance of these aspects is robust and aligns with the principles of ISO 14009-2020. Specifically, which of the following criteria, when considered together, would best enable the auditor to conclude that an environmental aspect has been appropriately evaluated for significance in the context of product design and development, particularly concerning potential regulatory noncompliance and actual environmental impact? Option A. The number of suppliers involved in providing materials related to the aspect and the overall production volume of the product. Option B. The availability of readily accessible recycling technologies for the materials involved and the public perception of the environmental impact. Option C. The frequency with which the aspect is discussed in internal design review meetings and the cost associated with its potential mitigation. Option D. The aspect's potential for significant harm to the environment, the likelihood of its occurrence, and its potential contravention of applicable environmental legislation or standards, such as the EU's Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment (WEEE) directive. The correct answer is D. The aspect's potential for significant harm to the environment, the likelihood of its occurrence, and its potential contravention of applicable environmental legislation or standards, such as the EU's Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment (WEEE) directive. Explanation: ISO 14009-2020, a guideline for integrating environmental aspects into product design and development, emphasizes a life cycle perspective. When an internal auditor evaluates the significance of environmental aspects within this framework, they must consider criteria that reflect potential environmental impact and regulatory relevance. The significance of an environmental aspect is determined by a combination of factors, including its severity, scale, likelihood of occurrence, and regulatory status. For instance, a process that generates a small but highly toxic waste stream that is also subject to stringent discharge limits, like those under the European Union's REACH regulation or the US EPA's Clean Water Act, would likely be deemed significant. Conversely, an aspect with a potentially large scale but minor impact and no specific regulatory oversight might be considered less significant. The auditor's role is to verify that the organization has a systematic method for evaluating these aspects, ensuring that the criteria used are consistent with the organization's environmental policy and objectives, and that the evaluation process adequately considers potential environmental impacts throughout the product's life cycle, from raw material extraction to end-of-life disposal. This includes looking at aspects that may not be immediately obvious, but could have cumulative or synergistic effects. The ultimate goal is to ensure that the most impactful environmental aspects are prioritized for mitigation and management within the design and development process. Question 27. During an internal audit of a company developing a new line of portable electronic devices, the auditor is reviewing the initial product development documentation. The company's environmental management system, aligned with ISO 14009-2020, mandates the integration of environmental aspects from the earliest stages. Considering the directive to minimize environmental impacts throughout the product lifecycle, which of the following actions taken during the conceptualization phase would be considered the most robust implementation of ISO 14009-2020 principles for this product category? Option A. Conducting a comprehensive life cycle assessment, LCA, to identify potential environmental hotspots and defining design parameters to mitigate the most significant identified impacts from the outset. Option B. Engaging with suppliers to gauge their environmental performance and selecting those with existing ISO 14001 certifications for key components. Option C. Establishing a preliminary list of compliance requirements for all target markets, ensuring the product concept adheres to existing regulations like WEEE and RoHS. Option D. Developing a detailed end-of-life management plan, including reverse logistics and recycling strategies, before finalizing the product's core design features. The correct answer is A. Conducting a comprehensive life cycle assessment, LCA, to identify potential environmental hotspots and defining design parameters to mitigate the most significant identified impacts from the outset. Explanation. The core principle of ISO 14009-2020 is the proactive integration of environmental considerations throughout the product lifecycle, starting from the conceptualization and design phases. This standard emphasizes a systematic approach to identifying and managing environmental aspects, aiming to prevent pollution and minimize negative environmental impacts. During the conceptualization phase, the focus is on defining the product's intended function and scope, which directly influences potential environmental burdens. Identifying significant environmental aspects at this early stage allows for the selection of design strategies that inherently reduce these impacts. For instance, choosing materials with lower embodied energy or designing for disassembly and recyclability are decisions made during conceptualization that have profound downstream environmental consequences. Regulatory compliance, such as adherence to directives like the EU's Restriction of Hazardous Substances, RoHS, or the End-of-Life Vehicles, ELV directive, must also be considered from the outset to avoid costly redesigns or market access issues. The goal is to embed environmental performance as a key design criterion, not as an afterthought. This proactive stance aligns with the principles of eco-design and circular economy, ensuring that environmental considerations are fundamental to the product's very existence and development path, thereby contributing to a more sustainable approach to product creation. Question 28. When auditing an organization's environmental management plan, EMP, for product design and development, an internal auditor is reviewing the process for a new electronic gadget. The design team has identified that the manufacturing process for the gadget's casing generates significant amounts of waste solvent. The EMP states a target to reduce solvent waste by 15% by the end of the fiscal year. The auditor finds that the current waste management procedure involves sending all solvent waste to a licensed hazardous waste disposal facility, with no documented efforts to recover or recycle the solvent. Considering the principles of ISO 14009-2020 for integrating environmental aspects into product design, what is the most critical finding for the internal auditor to report regarding the effectiveness of the EMP in addressing the significant environmental aspect of solvent waste? Option A. The EMP's target of a 15% reduction is achievable solely through improved disposal efficiency, and no further action is required until the target is missed. Option B. The auditor should focus on the potential for redesigning the casing to use a solvent-free manufacturing process, as this is a more direct application of ISO 14009. Option C. The organization is correctly complying with hazardous waste disposal regulations by using a licensed facility, which is the primary focus of the EMP. Option D. The EMP's objective to reduce solvent waste is not being adequately supported by operational controls that explore solvent recovery or recycling opportunities. The correct answer is D. The EMP's objective to reduce solvent waste is not being adequately supported by operational controls that explore solvent recovery or recycling opportunities. Explanation. The core of developing an effective environmental management plan, EMP, for product design and development, as guided by ISO 14009-2020, lies in systematically identifying, evaluating, and controlling environmental aspects throughout the product lifecycle. This process necessitates a proactive approach, moving beyond mere compliance to integrating environmental considerations as a strategic element of design. The guideline emphasizes a structured methodology for this integration. Initially, the organization must establish a framework for identifying environmental aspects associated with product design and development activities, including material selection, manufacturing processes, packaging, distribution, use, and end-of-life management. This involves considering potential impacts on air, water, soil, biodiversity, and human health. Following identification, a crucial step is the evaluation of these aspects to determine their significance. Significance is typically assessed based on criteria such as magnitude, duration, reversibility, and legal requirements. For instance, a material choice that results in significant hazardous waste generation during disposal, or a manufacturing process that emits high levels of volatile organic compounds (VOC), would likely be deemed significant. Once significant aspects are identified, the EMP must define objectives and targets for improvement. These objectives should be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound, SMART. For example, an objective might be to reduce the use of non-recyclable packaging by 20% within 2 years. The EMP then details the operational controls and measures to achieve these objectives. This includes defining responsibilities, allocating resources, establishing training programs, and implementing monitoring and measurement procedures. For the scenario presented, the internal auditor's role is to verify that the organization's EMP for product design and development effectively addresses the identified significant environmental aspects, and that the controls implemented are adequate to achieve the set objectives and targets. This verification involves reviewing documentation, conducting interviews, and observing practices to ensure alignment with ISO 14009-2020 principles. The most critical element for an internal auditor to assess is the evidence that the EMP is actively driving the reduction of identified significant environmental aspects by implementing appropriate controls, thereby demonstrating a commitment to environmental performance improvement within the design process. Question 29. When conducting an internal audit of an organization's product design and development processes, guided by ISO 14009-2020, what is the primary purpose of maintaining comprehensive records related to the integration of environmental aspects throughout the product lifecycle? Option A. Provide documented evidence of systematic consideration and control of environmental aspects during product design and development, supporting conformity and continuous improvement. Option B. To serve as a marketing tool by showcasing the company's commitment to sustainability through detailed design documentation. Option C. To fulfill legal obligations under environmental regulations that mandate the logging of all design-related decisions, regardless of their environmental relevance. Option D. To create a historical archive of all design iterations for potential patent applications and intellectual property protection. Correct answer is A. To provide documented evidence of systematic consideration and control of environmental aspects during product design and development, supporting conformity and continuous improvement. Explanation. ISO 14009-2020 provides guidance on integrating environmental aspects into product design and development, a key component of an effective environmental management system, including one that supports product design, is the maintenance of appropriate records. These records serve as evidence of conformity with requirements and demonstrate the effectiveness of implemented processes. For an internal auditor assessing an organization's adherence to ISO 14009, understanding the purpose and scope of these records is crucial. Records related to product design and development should encompass information that illustrates how environmental considerations, such as material selection, energy efficiency during use, and end-of-life treatment, have been systematically incorporated. This includes design specifications, risk assessments pertaining to environmental impacts, life cycle assessment data, supplier declarations on material composition, and records of design reviews where environmental aspects were explicitly addressed. The retention period for these records is typically determined by regulatory requirements, the organization's own policies, and the nature of the information itself, ensuring that historical data is available for analysis, continuous improvement, and potential audits. The aim is to provide a traceable history of environmental decision-making throughout the product lifecycle, from conception to disposal. Question 30. When conducting an internal audit of an organization's product design and development process for compliance with ISO 14009-2020, focusing on spill control and containment, what specific evidence would an auditor prioritize to demonstrate the proactive integration of environmental aspects? Option A. Examination of the company's emergency response plan for chemical spills that occurred during the previous fiscal year. Option B. Review of design documentation for integrated secondary containment features and material selection that minimizes leak potential during the product's intended use and disposal phases. Option C. Assessment of the number of nonconformance reports related to spills that were issued to the production department. Option D. Verification of employee training records on general environmental awareness and hazardous material handling. Correct answer is B. Review of design documentation for integrated secondary containment features and material selection that minimizes leak potential during the product's intended use and disposal phases. Explanation. The question pertains to the internal auditor's role in verifying the integration of environmental aspects into product design, specifically concerning spill control and containment measures as guided by ISO 14009-2020. The core of ISO 14009 is about embedding environmental considerations throughout the product lifecycle, starting from design and development. Spill control and containment are critical environmental aspects that must be addressed during the design phase to prevent or minimize potential environmental impacts. An internal auditor assessing this integration would look for evidence that these considerations are not merely reactive measures, but are proactively designed into the product and its manufacturing processes. This involves reviewing design specifications, material selection, manufacturing process design, and operational procedures for potential release points and the corresponding containment strategies. The auditor must verify that the organization has established a systematic approach to identify, assess, and manage environmental aspects related to potential spills, ensuring that the design choices and operational controls are effective in preventing, containing, and mitigating their impact. This includes evaluating the adequacy of secondary containment for storage of hazardous materials, design features that minimize the risk of leaks during operation or transport, and emergency response plans that are integrated into the product's intended use and disposal. The auditor's objective is to confirm that the organization's environmental management system, as applied to product design, adequately addresses these potential environmental risks.